Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Alex Byrne, Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Philosophy at MIT. He is author of Trouble with Gender, Sex, Facts, Gender Fictions, 2023, and a co-author of Treatment for Pediatric Gender Dysphoria, Review of Evidence and Best Practices, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, 2025. I welcome Alex Byrne to Savage Minds. I am very excited to speak with you, Alex, because you and I have these temporarily distant but shared trajectories with the gender wars, as I call it. I was more involved in this from 2012. Paradoxically, I was in Soho in London during Gay Pride and was told by a bunch of mostly lesbians about what was happening in the UK. And I thought, they're drunk. That was my first reaction. I thought, this is not possible that people are claiming that people can change sex. This is years apart from the kind of queer theory that I knew in the early 90s. Little by little, right. I started to investigate. I realized that things were actually exactly as they had told me. And I started to write about this issue. And my first article on this I put out with Counterpunch, and I received over 100 death and rape threats, some left on my editor's voicemail in California, he and his daughter as well. And my daughter had rape threats at the age of 6 months old, right? I went to the Met. The Met was able to do nothing. I had to hire a private solicitor to send out specific letters to 3 people, one of whom was a Guardian writer. And I had to leave the country. Paradoxically, we sought haven in the Middle East for a few months. and then the rest is history. Then I got to know, I was contacted by people who were very involved in this prior to me and who started to get involved because of reading my piece or even the infamous pieces by Suzanne Moore, January 2013, with the follow-up by Julie Birchhill, which was Scorcher. I loved it, but they both got into trouble. And then, of course, I've read about what has happened with you. And I'd like to know if maybe we could talk about some of the foundational concepts and definitions that led to this kind of mass hypnosis of sorts over something that is really flat earthery of another sort, I would argue. You define woman as an adult female of our species.
Yeah.
Why has this biological definition become so contentious in modern philosophical discourse specifically?
Well, I think there's a long tradition in the feminist literature that's very much against biological conceptions of womanhood on this, I think, somewhat confused grounds that if you hold that to be a woman is to be an adult human female or to be a member of a certain biological kind, it doesn't really matter what it is, then of course, if you're a woman, then you're constrained by the limitations of that biological kind. If you're a woman and you're an adult human female, then the limitations of womanhood are precisely the limitations of femalehood. So I think there's that strand. Reducing women to their biology is bad. It's biological essentialism, regressive, it's anti-feminist. And then there's another much more contemporary strand, which is that if you have to be female, you have to have a certain biological configuration in order to be a woman, then it looks like trans women are not going to be women, which is viewed as completely unacceptable and beyond the pale. So I think there are, I should say at the start that I think you probably know a lot more about this, especially the history, than I do, because I believe you taught at NYU for a number of years. Was that in the 90s?
Yes.
So you're more sort of au fait with transgender theory than I am, and also the history of feminism. But my view is that there are 2 main strands pushing against the idea that to be a woman is to be a mature female of our species. One is this antipathy towards biological essentialism and the idea that you're just limiting what women can do if you think of them in purely biological terms. And then the other quite different strand is the trans one, that trans women in particular are not going to count as women if the biological conception is correct.
And how do you respond to the claim that your focus on biological sex is out of touch with the contemporary understanding of human identity? This is something I've seen both within your field, but even in general, because this is brought down to, like, are you wearing flared jeans or not? I mean, since when has science been akin to fashion in terms of what's in or out of style? I mean, there's a bit of that to this as well, like old-fashioned versus in with the crowd. It's bizarre because we're talking about science, again, not dangly earrings.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, on the issue of sex, of course, there's this other sort of intellectual movement as well, which kind of operates in parallel to the trans opposition to biological conceptions of womanhood, namely the anti-sex strand. Obviously, you find that in Butler and Anne Fausto Sterling and other writers. They think that sex is either socially constructed, or there are more than two sexes, or sex is on a spectrum, or the notion of biological sex doesn't really make very much sense. It's not theoretically useful, and we should really stick to something that's more concrete and definite and well-defined. For instance, the assignment of sex that you're given at birth. Maybe the fact of my maleness is extremely obscure and unclear and not worth bothering with, but the fact is that I was ticked off on the M box when I was born. No one can deny that. So let's use that as just a replacement for this problematic notion of sex. So if you like, it's a kind of pincer movement. On the one hand, well, look, we just granted the male-female distinction for the sake of the argument. There absolutely have to be male women. Otherwise, trans women will not be women. But then, on the other hand, that's really just conceding too much, because the very notion of biological sex doesn't make any sense, or at least the traditional binary notion doesn't make any sense.
Well, I presume you've read some of Butler and perhaps been able to get through some of...
I have.
Okay. I've taught it.
I know you have read Butler. You probably read a lot more and a lot more carefully than me.
I have, but and it's not to dis. She's written some very clear things. Her work on post 9/11 terrorism, phobia, etc., is very interesting and coherent. I cannot say the same about Bodies That Matter or Gender Trouble. Now, I did write my doctoral thesis. My first book takes this to task. I have an argument with Butler, and it goes like this. It's a very long piece I'm working on called Has Judith Butler Read Judith Butler? Because this is my thesis here. I could be wrong, but I actually think a lot of what we call today the transgender movement grew out of the incongruity of her work with interpretation of her work based on precisely the incoherency and I think the lack of access to much of her work. I'm not talking just about the fact that she won that prize, which is the literary or I guess academic Razzie, that too. But really, when I teach her to graduate students, I have never once been able to teach the whole book. And I've taught whole books of Foucault. I cannot teach that book. I have to select, I believe it's chapters, the introduction, I think the first two chapters, or maybe chapters 2 and 3, and then one later or not, depending, because the students cannot get through it. Now, I'm all about academic language has its place. Philosophical language has its place. It's not like you're sitting around talking about Husserl saying this thingamajig and that whatchamacallit, words have a meaning. And I believe it's important to underscore that and not just throw away the baby with the bathwater here in terms of the discourse that is precise to, let's say, philosophy. At the same time, gender trouble was about a construction. It was really in the early days of queer theory, where there was this liberation of the homophobic, let's say, core of society from the playfulness of gender. It was not about go out and cut off your bits to match this template at all. So I was always very confused, especially from that day in June of 2012 when I was highly pregnant and hearing these women tell me about what had happened. And I'm thinking, that's not what Butler wrote. That's not what she was about. I have my issues with her, but that was not it. And I do think, Alex, that some of what we're seeing, a lot of what we're seeing, including this mania towards medical prognosis, towards this kind of metamorphosis of the body forced, and then, of course, the slippery slope that happens because of what's happened, as we know, with the Tavistock and many other clinics around the world, especially far worse in the US, because of the privatization and the nature of private medicine in the US, versus what has happened in, let's say, Holland, Sweden, and then, of course, the UK. I have a real problem with the fact that that slippery slope exists because people will say, and they speak out of both sides of their mouth on this, I'm sure you know, adults can do what they want to their bodies. But wait a second, children watch what adults do. It's not like there's this kind of truncation and it's like, okay, you can do anything you want when you're 18, because we also know that a lot of the social contagion around this happened not just under 18, but also people in their late teens and early, even mid-20s. I watched this in London. I was DJing at Vauxhall Pub a few months before I gave birth. It was my last hooray to DJing. And there were these two women, so I thought, and they were the sound assistants, and I asked them about some cables that I needed because they had a different setup than I had imagined. And I said, could you ask the other woman about that? And she goes, well, she's not a woman. We're trans men. Long story short, turns out one of them was Palestinian. We started speaking in Arabic, and I'm like, what the hell? Well, you know this is nonsense. I really did. I laid into the whole, you are a woman. And if you're butch, or you want to call, I don't even like these words in the lesbian community, this somehow became a thing. Butch, lipstick lesbian, soft butch, all of that. I mean, I'm a lesbian. I don't even have the dictionary for this. I can't keep up with it. Now, I say this sort of tongue in cheek, but not completely. I think that there's been a contagion by the older part of this community. They want the affirmation given by the medical prognosis of children, which I find demented on the one hand, quite dangerous too, but it speaks to this kind of aporia of spirit. I mean, what happened to, I'm thinking of the late 80s, early 90s, where here we're queer, we're proud of it, and now it's like we have to cut ourselves up to please a mid-20th century stereotype. It all reeks to me of problems. And then back to what you said a few minutes ago about a lot of what's coming out of the trans community is a reverberation of what women were doing once upon a time, and feminists even, in trying to disassociate a kind of reality of womanhood from the body. And many people have pointed this out, and the feminists get angry. But I think that, they need to start to confront that and look at this seriously, because I would argue this falls into a larger problem of identity politics. And I don't mean just sex and gender, but that too.
I mean, of course, the gender trouble, at least as I read it, is quite anti identity politics. And in that book, Butler's no fan of multiplying identities. It is, or placing all that much importance on them. It is interesting because, this is obviously not unique to Butler, but, you might have naively expected Butler to be this fearless thought leader, just saying what she thinks and not responding or reacting to the current zeitgeist. But of course, she has changed her views over the years in the direction of the prevailing tides. So, she's all for pediatric medicalization for gender dysphoria. She's explicit that trans women are women. It's kind of amusing because Butler herself has sort of like repeatedly refused to say that she herself is a woman. That of course one of the original points was supposed to be, I think this is like completely confused, but one of the original points was supposed to be, it's not even original with Butler actually, that the category of woman is somehow unstable or some kind of weird gender shapeshifter. It's sort of inherently unstable because woman has meant different things in different times, different places. The very claim that someone is a woman is deeply obscure. But of course, when push comes to shove, Butler will just say like unequivocally, yes, well, trans women are women. I may not be a woman, but Caitlyn Jenner certainly is one.
Well, that's the paradox that so many feminists are angry about, and I get their ire because everyone is woman ? Except men who claim to be women. So a lot of feminists have pointed out that this is about supplanting what womanhood is and making men into the uber women, and we are somehow subspecies of women. Bizarre, but it's true. Butler herself has gone out of her, I guess we're misgendering her because doesn't she go by they now?
Yes, no, that's right. That is true. I'm all for respecting people's preferred pronouns, but I think in the case of Judith Butler, I really have to make an exception. As soon as you they her, you're essentially buying in to the whole belief system that I completely reject. And also, if Butler made some huge effort to be androgynous or something like that, maybe you could cut her some slack. But she just like presents as this like ordinary, vaguely butch woman.
If gender is amorphous and detached from any kind of specificity, but men who claim to be women are quite specific in her latest work on this and her latest speaking events, then it's solipsistic, ultimately, her whole theory or revamped theory. Because, again, I challenge anyone to show me in Gender Trouble where she's actually advocating for this kind of surgical identity. It was about performativity, and it takes up many of the ideas that you'll find in, I'm thinking of Isaac Julian's film, Looking for Langston. I'm thinking of early 1990s filmmakers, artists, dancers who were exploring gender, but as performance. They were not saying that men do not have penises or that lesbians have penises and all this nonsense that has come about in the last 15 years. But this was about this kind of uncoupling of prejudicial notions of homosexuality, for one, in the post-AIDS era, or rather the post-you don't die of AIDS era from 1996 on, with the innovations of Crixivan and so forth. Yeah. And at the same time, it was about making visible these kinds of identities. So you had these kinds of identities. So you had people like Marlon Riggs, who was very important in the African-American filmmaking community and what was then gay male filmmaking. Today, that wouldn't be called, now you can't say gay, you have to say queer. And a lot of my friends in the East Village who are working on various art cooperatives started to fall into that. We've had, and we still do have discussions about why this evaporation of the word gay. Why can you not say gay? It's not the same thing as queer. And it's interesting because a lot of people are now going back and starting to reapply the word gay. I don't know. It's very odd. Yeah.
Of course, it does remain in LGBTQ, IA++. So there's some kind of fossilized relic the word gay. But yeah, I mean, and homosexual, of course, is deprecated in many quarters. It's funny because, you know, I don't know where did you grow up in the UK or?
No, I moved there quite long story, but yes, I started going there in late 2007. And then I ended up immigrating there. My children were born there. I've done a lot of work there, but no, I grew up between Canada and New Orleans, Mississippi, and then New York.
Oh, right. Well, I grew up in the UK, and of course, the 1970s was the decade of gender bending and so on. And
there in late 2007. And then I ended up immigrating there. My children were born there. I've done a lot of work there, but no, I grew up between Canada and New Orleans, Mississippi, and then New York.
Oh, right. Well, I grew up in the UK, and of course, the 1970s was the decade of gender bending and so on. And, you know, gender nonconformity, is a lot of like overt gender nonconformity in certain bits of popular culture was very evident. And I just don't remember thinking too much of it, or I don't remember people making all that much of a fuss about it. But then, of course, there was a lot of gender nonconformity. But no one ever thought that. It's now the 80s rather than the 70s, but no one ever thought that, you know, Boy George might be a woman, or Annie Lennox might be a man, or anything like that. And then if we fast forward to this century, lo and behold, gender nonconformity is now it's an indicator for medical treatment. So if you read, you know, W. Path's Standards of Care, or like numerous papers on pediatric gender medicine, the target group is not just transgender youth, but gender non-conforming youth. Often they don't call them gender non-conforming anymore, rather gender diverse, but it's exactly the same thing. So, like the very notion that being gender non-conforming is some kind of indication that you might need medical treatment is, I think, to anyone who like grew up in the 70s or the 80s, completely bizarre. But so, I mean, if you're as old as I am, then this surely regressive movement from the acceptance of gender nonconformity as it is to trying to fix it with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones is completely bizarre and strange and inexplicable.
Like you, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and seeing David Bowie or Freddie Mercury or Elton John or Flock of Seagulls or ABC, like their videos were pretty darn amazing. But you could watch them and think anything. You could guess that they might be gay or straight. It didn't even matter, because that's the nature of video making, the birth of MTV. Even ABBA, they were making videos way before, even in the 70s. And when you start to look at what performativity was about, and I do mean in a very Butlerian way, they were performing music, and music was always about, I mean, opera, hello. It was always about, if you want to go to Wayne Kostenbaum's The Queen's Voice, if you've read that text, but there was something in opera about finding one's identity, because of course, we know historically, and there are many studies that happened during the era of not just Judith Butler's first work, but Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Between Men, and then her more infamous Epistemology of the Closet. This was about sort of uncovering the closets. the trans movement, the transgender identity movement, to me, is the most regressive thing I've seen in my life or I've lived through. And I wonder how it became such a hot button item in Anglophone cultures. It hasn't hit Spain or Italy in the same way that it has the US and Britain.
Yeah, that's puzzling.
What do you think this is about? Because, I mean, I'm in Italy now, and they had during lockdown this decision of the Legge Zan, the Zan law, which was, it didn't go through. And many people will say it's because of the Vatican. Many people will make arguments about conservative, blah, 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 Italian culture. But it comes down to people know that men are not women. And it's not something that Italians are going to kowtow to very easily. At the same time, this is still being meted out in Australia, Tasmania especially. You've got still in Canada many court battles going on, parents who've been quasi put into prison or threats of prison because they won't let their daughter or son use medical or pharmaceutical methods of quote unquote transitioning. Even the language of this. I mean, I'm thinking, Alex, that this all goes back to instilling a kind of language that is allowing us to discuss this. So even saying, just like when you said, if I say they, it gives reality to it. I think it goes back to even that. If we say transition and what sex were you assigned at birth? Holy cow, is this where we are now? I feel like I'm on a Star Trek episode.
Yeah, I know one of the fascinating things about the trans rights movement is the excessive amount of language policing. It's very difficult to speak in the right way, partly because the rules are often changing, and what's an acceptable way of talking now might not be an acceptable way of talking in 6 months' time. It's funny. I was reading a gender studies textbook the other day, which was published in 2019, and there's some chapter on trans issues. And they're talking about Caitlyn Jenner. So this is like 4 years after the 2015 Vanity Fair, was it? Famous cover with Jenner, Call Me Caitlyn. And they dead name Caitlyn Jenner. I mean, this is an extremely progressive, of course, it's my gender studies textbook. They say, yeah, well, she used to be Bruce Jenner. And so that's 2019, but a couple of years earlier in 2017, Rebecca Tuval, who was then an untenured assistant professor of philosophy, had published this article in defense of transracialism in the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia. I'm sure you know about this.
Oh yeah, I wrote about it. Hysterical.
Yeah. But one of the many complaints was that Rebecca had dead named Caitlyn Jenner. There was like some footnote or something like that, or parenthetical remark, formerly Bruce Jenner. And although Rebecca didn't prostrate herself before the mob, she did actually make one concession, which was to amend the article. So the dead naming was no longer present. So if you now look at the article on the Hypatia website, there's no hint that Caitlyn was formerly Bruce. But it just shows how sort of fashions change, because I guess the authors of that 2019 textbook hadn't quite caught up to the dead naming prohibition, even though it was two years after Rebecca apologized for dead naming Caitlyn. And of course, now dead naming is just completely beyond the pale. I'm sure if you go to Caitlyn Jenner's webpage, I don't know, but I suspect if you go to Caitlyn Jenner's Wikipedia page, there's no mention of her former name. Actually, someone should fact check me on that.
The whole dead naming thing, though, I find again, did we live through the Enlightenment or not? What the hell is this? That we're supposed to all pretend collectively that we do not remember Bruce Jenner's muscly arms throwing the javelin. I mean, I was a kid and I remember that.
Bruce was on the Wheaties box, if you remember.
Oh, that's right.
The Breakfast of Champions. Oh, yeah. And then, sorry, just another thing about the whole dead naming thing, which just shows that it really is just a matter of fashion. So in the Health and Human Services report on pediatric gender dysphoria, which was published last year, on which I was a co-author, there's a chapter on the history of medical transitioning. And so, of course, we mentioned Christine Jorgensen, who was the most famous male to female transsexual, certainly not the first, but was the first to achieve worldwide fame. And we dead name Christine. He was George Jorgensen originally. And of course, in Christine Jorgensen's own autobiography, I can't remember when that was written, like the 60s or the 70s or something. Of course, she says that, she was born George and so on. It's like not a secret. It was just no big deal. It was absolutely no big deal. Why on earth would you hide that? Especially since in the case of Christine, it was just like impossible to hide anyway. And then, various sympathetic biographies of Christine, one in particular, dead names Christine all over the place. Okay, so like historically, there was just no issue with that, least of all from Christine Jorgensen herself. But then a frequent complaint against the HHS review is that we dead name Christine Jorgensen. So this is some mortal sin and an indication that the authors were total transphobes.
This speaks to me of a larger social malaise with truthful discussion. Because what is this era then if we're expected to kowtow to delusion? And I would argue delusion. We can't pretend that someone did not exist as a man. Like just insisting that we think of Caitlyn Jenner winning the Olympics is insane. Because this is a denial of history. It's a denial of collective memory. And what is the point then? I've always wondered about this. I've done a few pieces for Quillette on the dead naming industry.
Oh, right. Oh, okay.
Because it's part of the larger policing industry as well. They love to police. No, there were quite a few stars that they would come out and say, I have to go back to my Quillette piece, but there's this one guy who was prominent on the internet about 5 years ago. And he went around saying that this person wasn't really a lesbian. She was really trans. And I'm like, oh, here we go. Oh, here we go. Like Marlene Dietrich is soon going to be Manfred Dietrich or something. Just wait for it. Just because of that one scene in Morocco where she's in a tuxedo. If we're going to do that, again, you mentioned Annie Lennox. Annie Lennox is in trouble. We're all in trouble. And this is the play. This is why I think Butler is a kind of linchpin here, because if you take her gender trouble and her latest pronouncements, because she does bask in the limelight of this mania, she loves what it's become. I would be distancing myself from this because I don't think it'll be a good look for her posthumously to be the ideological driver for the mass sterilization of gay kids predominantly. And that's what this is. I'm sorry to be blunt. But we're living in a place now, Alex, where to distinguish between biological sex and the sociocultural gender is a danger. Why have people fallen into this circular or muddled logic? Because, again, read science, even go back to Descartes. I mean, the Enlightenment was important for many of the things we're discussing here. Even the whole notion of dichotomy, which is something within Muslim philosophy or Islamic philosophy, was also addressed in a very different way, albeit, including gender. The reality is that we know that one sex makes children occur within the body and they give birth, and the other sex has a participation in that, but it's very different. Yeah. To allocate sex and gender, and you know this, you've seen that hat trick that they pull with gender is between your legs, sex is between your ears, the brain, right? And I had Gina Rippon on the show to discuss the gendered brain, in which she absolutely dismantled. Could you talk about this muddled logic and where you think that has come from and maybe where it might be going? Because some of this is also falling to the side, I've noticed.
Yeah, these questions, these big sweeping questions of where all this came from and where it's going and what the explanation is for the success of the trans movement in the UK, or at least I guess we're now regressing a bit. The success of the trans movement in the UK and the US compared to, say, other European countries like Italy. Those questions I do find extremely hard to answer, just because in general explaining broad social movements is a very difficult matter. And, there's always a kind of suspicion that you're just like retrofitting your explanation to the history. You're not really getting at the root causes, because one indication of that is that people are extremely poor at predicting large social trends and social changes, which is a kind of indication that when people look back and say, yes, but why did this happen exactly? Why did the trans rights movement suddenly emerge from the successes of the gay rights movement? Maybe we're just spinning plausible sounding stories without having any deep understanding of why that is. Because if we did have some deep understanding, then we would be able to predict the next social change, but we're extremely bad at that. One thing, maybe this doesn't quite address your question, and obviously it's a point that's been made before, but given the success of the gay rights movement, there was a lot of spare, unused NGO activist capacity. A lot of organizations like GLAAD had nothing much to do once gay marriage was secured, and perhaps they should have shut up shop, but of course they didn't. They used their staff and their money to promote the next, as they framed it, civil rights frontier, namely trans rights. But it doesn't really explain the obsession with policing language and the vitriol that has been, hurled at feminists, yourself included. The gay rights movement, it certainly had its militant wing, but for the most part, it was really quite friendly and accommodating and not particularly aggressive.
I think a lot of the feminists will talk about how women embrace this because they would say we're raised to be welcoming, to be positive towards other people, and it's very hard for women to say no. And I think that happened both between women and many gay organizations. There was this, let's let them in the door, without anyone thinking, what is this going to lead to? I don't think any of them thought in 1996 that this was going to lead to sterilization of gay youth. And even then, you've seen what's happened with Stonewall UK.
Yeah.
With Ruth Hunt and even her predecessor.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, this is crazy. Or go to mermaids. And I've had a lot to do with them because that first article I did, I interviewed them. Got on record, woman on the phone. And I had two people in the room with me as I was transcribing the interview. And she talked about Wendy houses. I didn't know what a Wendy house was. Wow. And she says, well, my son wanted a Wendy house. And I said, what does that have to do with the price of eggs? I played hockey in the streets in Canada. That didn't make me a boy. Yeah, I was one of the few girls out on the streets playing hockey in Southern Ontario. But again, these are the same kinds of things that all men and women, when they were boys and girls, deal with. We all have. I have friends who are male who had problems because they wanted to draw on their off time from schoolwork. And one of their parents said, why don't you go outside and play football? Well, he didn't want to play football. He wanted to draw horses. Everyone deals with the pressure of gender in various ways. And I'll never forget that interview. And after that happened, FYI, one of the people in the interview, a Camden-based LGB Alphabet plus, they called me to say, well, can you change this? Because they were harassed. They were harassed by one of the people who later made death threats to me. The reach of these lobbies is phenomenal in my mind, because the logical response is to write a repost, right? You don't just go out and start harassing people who made comments or threatened me. And that happened. So I'm thinking this is a lobby that exists on this kind of conceptual slippery slope where gender identity is ushered in. It's new. People like new things. But where do you believe this term originated, and why did it gain such rapid traction, including within philosophy?
Well, gender identity, that is an excellent point. I mean, I think the philosophers were the philosophers who've written on gender identity, they were just picking up on the fact that it had become common currency or part of the conceptual toolkit among trans rights activists, and indeed, it's like the central way of, not the only way, but maybe the central way of explaining what it is to be either transgender or cisgender, namely to have one of these gender identities that either doesn't match your sex or sex assigned at birth, in which case you're transgender, or else does match, in which case you're cisgender. And I mean, that just originated within trans rights activism, as far as I can make out. Although the notion of gender identity itself goes back to the 1960s. It was first properly defined by these psychiatrists at UCLA, Robert Stoller and Ralph Greenson. Greenson was Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist, by the way. Kind of interesting little tidbit. And they just defined it. They defined it very well and usefully as the conviction that you're one sex or the other. And in that sense, of course, everyone or almost everyone does have a gender identity, although not exactly when you're born, but some years afterwards, you become convinced, usually rightly, that you're either male or that you're female. But that notion of gender identity is very ill-suited to explain what it is to be transgender, because, of course, you can be transgender, you can be like a trans woman and yet be convinced and yet know that you're actually male. So your gender identity in the Stoller-Greenson sense does match your sex. But of course, you're transgender, you're not cisgender. So then, it's a complicated, fascinating story. But then the notion gender identity morphed and changed and became progressively more obscure. philosophers, to some extent, have adopted a sort of critical view of gender identity. They often don't take it for granted. I mean, one philosopher who's a trans woman called Rach Koska-Rowland recently wrote a book which came out with Oxford University Press called Gender Identity, What It Is and Why It Matters. And she certainly doesn't take the notion for granted. She tries to explain what it is. In my view, it's just like a dismal failure, and the book is like riddled with errors of various sorts. But at least the effort is there. Incidentally, sorry, this is just to go off at a slight tangent, but just as an indication of the climate within academic philosophy, I don't know if you came across this very recent report called something like a report on the state of scholarship in the humanities, which was commissioned by the Chancellor of Vanderbilt University and maybe someone at WashU. But anyway, it was written by a committee of 9 people, including 4 philosophers, and they single out, so it's about history and anthropology and other fields in the humanities, English literature, including philosophy, and the philosophy of sex and gender is singled out in that report for special criticism. And they quote this philosopher who I think works in Australia called Mark Lance, who was extremely militant back in the day on the trans rights side and against philosophers like Kathleen Stock, who was famously cancelled over the course of about 3 years and had to resign from the University of Sussex. Anyway, so they quote Lance as saying, and let's see, I have the quote here. To produce arguments in this context that trans women are not women or trans lesbians are not lesbians is not just a view we can easily reject as confused and offensive. It is complicity with systemic violence and active encouragement of oppression. And he wrote that in 2019. And I mean, there are a number of notable features of that quote. One is the absurd bluster that the idea that trans women are not women or trans lesbians are not lesbians is it's a ridiculous, obviously false view. That is what he's saying. It's like saying that, the sky is red or something. It really is absurd. So that's his first point. And of course, this is just
Does this report criticize it?
Oh yes, indeed. Yeah. Sorry. Right. Exactly. Now this is just given. This is just given as an example of the anti-intellectual climate in philosophy when it comes to these issues. So it's a couple of years after 2019, a couple of years after Rebecca Tuval, and maybe a year after Kathleen Stock had started writing about sex and gender. But it's the most absurd bluff that you could imagine, because obviously it's okay. Maybe it turns out in the end, after you thought about it for a long time and examined all the arguments, that trans lesbians are indeed lesbians, but it's hardly self-evident
Well, when you start to look at lesbians themselves within the lesbian community or on dating apps, they leave the dating apps. They've left all the lesbian spaces, even in Boston. They've closed down, and they closed down even before this was an online contagion, because the same stuff was happening in real life. I know I was in a lesbian bar in the West Village, and I was sitting there, and it became apparent to me that there were more men, what I'm just going to use what the feminists would say, LARPing as women than lesbians. And what kind of lesbian would want to be in that? That's, it becomes like this Moebius strip of identity, and you don't really want to be part of it. So I'm so happy to see that the report takes this up, because I read, it was on my radar. I saw that Kwame Anthony Appiah was involved in this, and I really...
Oh yeah, that's right. Right.
I'm a fan of his work, and I would expect him to have an issue with that for myriad reasons.
I mean, I believe because I actually talked to Appiah like a couple of years ago, because I was teaching an intro philosophy class, and I made some video interviews with philosophers whose work we were reading in the class, and one of them was with Appiah. And it was apparent when we were chatting that he thinks that trans women are in fact women, or at least that was the impression I got from the interview. But of course, that's not the point. The point is that you can't reject the contrary view as completely beyond the pale and obviously confused. It's not, if you think, let's just grant that trans women are indeed women. This is not a proposition like the sky is blue or the earth is round or something like that. But then also, and then just another feature of the quote is and you kind of get the impression that, maybe Lance didn't really believe what he was actually saying, because normally in kind of scholarly discourse, if you say that a view is obviously false, then you should just stop there. I mean, what more is there to say? It's just obviously false. There can't be any greater criticism than that. You're in fact weakening your criticism if you then go on to say, and it also has these other bad features. Falsity is more than sufficient. But of course, Lance doesn't rest content with saying that this view is confused, i.e. false, and obviously so. He also says it's offensive, and it's complicity with systemic violence and active encouragement of repression. So he's trying to bully you into not voicing this view, even if you believe it, and you can't bring yourself to be persuaded otherwise. Still, you shouldn't say it because it's offensive and it's complicity with systemic
and words
violence.
are murder, right?
Exactly. The whole thing is so preposterous. But Lance, of course, he is a man, which is kind of amusing, just flatly asserting that trans lesbians are lesbians, but also, he's self-identified as a progressive, and this is the kind of thing that the in crowd was very fond of in philosophy at the time. It's not as if when he wrote this, I think this is in the Chronicle of Higher Education or something like that. It's not as if people were just up in arms and outraged about what he wrote. People on the progressive side thought, this is absolutely spot on. An excellent criticism. Anyway, that report is well worth reading. It's chaired by Paul Boghossian, not to be confused with Peter Boghossian, who's a well-known philosopher at NYU, your old school, and then there's Kwame Anthony Appiah and Kit Fine, and another philosopher, well-known philosopher at Princeton called Gideon Rosen.
Well, the Tuvel experience was a wake-up call, I think, to many in academia. And I've talked to people and tried to reach out to former colleagues of mine who were involved in what was then early days of queer theory and media studies, cinema studies, and a lot of them have fallen in line. Okay. I understand people have bills to pay, mortgages to pay, etc. But I do have to wonder why so many in academia have failed to speak out, because I know that, okay, there's you, of course, there's Kathleen Stock, there are some others, but many have written me privately saying, Brava, I'm too afraid to speak out. Oh, we agree with you, but
I get emails from that along those lines from time to time. It really is the most peculiar thing. I mean, I think it just shows that. Well, I don't know if academics are more cowardly than other people, like Uber drivers or plumbers, or but yeah, a lot of them certainly lack some spine when it comes to this sort of thing. As you say, people have to pay the bills and get tenure, and it certainly can be uncomfortable if you start speaking out at work, and a bunch of your students or your colleagues think you're some hideous bigot. So the social pressures are all there. But then, I mean, I keep repeating this point, but it's particularly demoralizing to find this sort of thing in the discipline of philosophy, which you would have thought would have attracted people who enjoy speaking out against orthodox views and enjoy being a gadfly and saying provocative things, following the argument where it leads.
Mm-hmm.
Not worrying over much about what people think of you, but are much more concerned with speaking truth to power, or upending the conventional apple cart. But then when it comes to sex and gender, of course, as you were saying, most people are cowering behind the parapet, not willing to put their heads above it.
Well, it also seems this is where, again, the feminists are right. They note how when the issue is a man who, I'm only putting these words in air quotes, transitions to becoming a woman, all in air quotes, that this kind of pushback to that, or the female penis, is very harsh. Meanwhile, when a woman walks into a male gym, and I'm referring to an incident that happened in London about 4 years ago, East London. She walked into a male gym saying she identifies as a trans man, blah, blah, blah. She was quickly shown the door. It made a spot, I think, on the Pink News, but there was no outrage over this. No homophobia. Men were allowed to say, gay men, it was a gay male gym, they were allowed to say, you're not a man, mate. Out, and she was shown the door. And yet every time there's an event, and some of our writers have been at these events all over Scotland, Wales, England, there's roughhousing, there's violence, there's threats of violence, all sorts of theatrics, as you well know. Now, have you seen this kind of ideology in another form within philosophical discourse? Because some people liken this to race theory, or the inclusionism that happens in the US. Bureaucratic inclusionism, I'm speaking of specifically, not the kind of historical understanding of the realities of racism and colonialism, which are a part. Have you seen this enter into philosophy with other valences, not just sex and gender? Because I'm always asking myself, why is this? Why this? Why not something else?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison with race is sort of interesting, because just as the biological conception of what it is to be a woman or a man, to be a man is to be an adult human male, and so on. Now, I would have thought that even though this position is routinely denied by philosophers who work on sex and gender or work in this area of philosophy called feminist philosophy, that notwithstanding, the view is extremely plausible. If you like, we can go into why it's extremely plausible. Okay, so it's widely denied, even though there's an awful lot to be said for it. Now, there is a parallel view, of course, in the case of race, which is, I think it's fair to say, less plausible. Not to say that it's implausible, but it's certainly less obvious than the biological view in the case of woman and man and boy and girl. So on this view, to be black or to be white or to be Asian is to have a certain ancient ancestry. When humans left Africa 200,000 years ago or something and started dispersing all over the globe, they changed in appearance in various ways, and in ways that you can easily visually distinguish. And people whose ancient ancestry is predominantly from sub-Saharan Africa are black. People whose ancient ancestry is predominantly from Asia, Asian, and so on this biological view of what race is. Whether you're black or white or Asian doesn't have anything to do with how you think of yourself or how people treat you or anything like that. It's just a matter of your ancestry. Okay, so that's the biological view of race, and it's often said that the biological view of race is obviously wrong. It's been refuted like again and again for various reasons. It's also sometimes said that the biological view of race is itself somewhat racist. But the interesting thing is that in the philosophy of race, of course, there aren't any like card-carrying racists in the philosophy of race or anything like that. Everyone's very much like against racism. The interesting thing is that in the philosophy of race, the biological view of race is actually taken very seriously. Right? This is a contender for an answer to the question: what is race exactly? What is it to be black or white or Asian or a Pacific Islander? There are social answers to that question. To be white is to be treated in a certain way, or to think of yourself in a certain way, or to occupy a certain kind of social position, something like that. But the biological view is taken very seriously. Unlike the philosophy of sex and gender, where the biological view of gender, of what it is to be a man or a woman, is typically like dismissed as a complete no-hoper. So there's an interesting asymmetry between the race case. I mean, I think that a lot of ordinary people would be somewhat surprised to find. Surprised to discover that the biological view of race is taken quite seriously within philosophy, especially when you also point out that the corresponding biological view of gender is widely held to have been refuted numerous times over and to be prejudicial and bigoted and so forth. So the philosophy of race is in a much healthier position, I think, than the philosophy of gender. But you were asking about inclusion, which was slightly different.
Well, no, also that, actually, because going back to Appia and his notion of racialism, in my father's house.
Yeah.
Or back even further, I mean, Darwin wasn't a philosopher, but even Darwin discredited this pure notion of race. I had Adam Rutherford on the show, and we discussed this at one point. And I think it's interesting how the notions that we know are more, let's say, hardwired in the human body are now being reverted into less important. And the notions such as race, which are much more fluid. I don't only mean these DNA tests that people are running out and getting, but let's face it, the notion of race was also a very convenient construction paired together with colonialism and all those practices that took place. They served a purpose. I think most people or most physicians would say that sex is much more clear on the physiognomy or the material reality of the human body over race.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting, Alex, how we're living in an era where all of this, philosophy is the perfect place to look at this kind of overturning of reality. I include social media. Social media itself, is it very social? Because it's turning a generation or two or now three into antisocial beings, where more and more studies are showing how many people are living online, do not have IRL interactions, really, except when they go to the market and pay for their milk. And I find it very interesting how we're living in this world of inversions of what words mean and what they are. Or that gender is now sex, sex is now gender, if you follow.
Yeah.
The volition to really push people, will people into believing that sex is not binary. For instance, in your work in Trouble with Gender, love the title, by the way, how do you reconcile this problem of sex as a binary with the biological existence of individuals with intersex conditions? Something that I've come across as well. People will try and gotcha you, and they'll say, oh, but there's intersex conditions.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of confusion around so-called intersex conditions, like a lot of which has to be laid at the door of Anne Hursto-Sterling, the Brown University Gender Studies academic. So if by sex is binary, you just mean that there are two sexes, then of course that's consistent with some human beings, might even be some huge number of human beings, not having a sex at all. So if that's what you mean by sex is binary, and someone comes along and says, yes, but look, there's this medical condition where if the person has it, there seems to be no fact of the matter about whether they're male or female. In some sense, they're sort of midway between. That's not a refutation of the claim that sex is binary. Unless being intersex is some third sex, which it most definitely is not, because on the orthodox conception of what a sex is, it's first and foremost, it's a reproductive category, and to the extent that people with intersex conditions can reproduce, they just reproduce in the normal sperm and eggs fashion. But then if by sex is binary you mean, and sometimes people do seem to mean this, what they seem to mean is that not just that there are two sexes, but that absolutely every human being without exception can be placed into the male bucket or the female bucket, then that thesis would indeed be refuted if there were some human beings who were neither male nor female. But then if you look at these so-called intersex conditions, I mean, the main reason why I think the terminology is extremely misleading is that, for the most part, people with so-called intersex conditions are unproblematically either male or female. I mean, a classic example of this is the condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where in the case of an XX fetus, the overactive adrenal glands produce an excess of androgens, and so when the baby's born, the genitals can be somewhat masculinized. But these people have ovaries and a uterus, and can, often just grow up as sort of somewhat masculinized girls. The scientific literature unequivocally classifies these people as females. They're females with a certain disorder of sex development, which somewhat masculinizes them. In certain extreme cases, it can really masculinize them. So the person, despite being female, lives as a man, but that's really very rare. So it's actually quite hard to find a disorder of sex development where the person is sexless, neither male nor female, or at any rate where the person's sex is extremely hard to determine. For the most part, you can readily make that classification. But I suppose the fundamental point is that if by two sexes if by sex is binary you mean there are exactly two sexes, then the existence of people with DSDs, disorders of sex development, or it's somewhat more softly put, differences of sex development, doesn't even begin to refute the binary thesis unless you argued further that people with these conditions are a third sex, for which there's no good argument whatsoever. And of course, at least these days, the intersex gambit is produced in the context of arguing about trans issues. But it's really basically irrelevant to trans issues. I mean, even if you thought, so some DSDs really can produce people who are a third sex, or can produce people who are neither male nor female. What has this got to do with, your average, I don't know, late transitioning trans woman who divorces his wife and transitions to live as a woman? If you're looking for some argument that this person has literally changed sex from male to female, then the intersex gambit is of no help whatsoever.
You're listening to Savage Minds. If you're enjoying the show, take a second to subscribe at savageminds.co. Feel free to comment below or drop us a line to share your thoughts. Support independent media today. Now, let's get back to it. Well, it's interesting the language that's used by the people who do quote unquote transition, and they talk about living their reality, affirming their identity, living as a woman or living as a man. And I tell you, Alex, I don't know what that means. I tell people all the time, the only time I have lived as a woman is menstruation and giving birth. Otherwise, people might say, oh, but I'm sure you've been hit on as a woman. Well, men have too. And that does not a woman or man make. And this is, I think, where this kind of slippage is happening. And it's become au courant within academic circles. But skip to the working class, union organizers, and people know what a woman is. And I don't mean this in this kind of simplistic, like that game Operation where you're not supposed to hit the side or it buzzes. And it's not this kind of rote, let's learn about human biology as a game. This is reality. We have gone out of our way since the 60s and 70s in most Western educational systems to form sex education, to avoid teen pregnancies. One of the bases of that is understanding who gets pregnant and who doesn't, right? And I find this all very odd because I remember back in around 2015 reading an article about this young lesbian who had a trans girlfriend, all in air quotes, and she got pregnant and she couldn't understand why. And I thought, oh my God, is this but this is Orwellian as well. Is this our future of, I'm sorry to put it this way, but of absolute stupidity? And I don't mean her. I believe that if systems are going to embrace this nonsense, they better buckle up for a load of teen pregnancies by people saying just that. Yeah. That's on the one hand. On the other, how do you address the argument that denying the validity of gender identity is a form of murder, of invalidation of personal experience? When people tell me this, Alex, I'm like, my reality is denied all the time. That's called being human. You have discussions with people. People don't agree with you about myriad factors of life, including your own, what you might call your identity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there was that recent case in Canada where some guy who was, I don't know, on some school board maybe, started speaking out about trans issues, and he was hauled up before, I think it was the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal. And,
oh, yes.
And the tribunal ruled against him. I'm not quite sure what his punishment was. I think maybe he was fined a considerable amount of money. But they claimed that because of his skepticism about gender identity, he was essentially denying the existence of trans people, which is like some form of erasure. And this was just not acceptable in Canadian society. But of course, I mean, what they forget whether you should be punished for denying the existence of trans people. But of course, to deny the coherence of the notion of gender identity is one thing. To deny that there are any trans people is quite another. You only get from the first to the second if you think, well, the only explanation you could possibly give of what it is to be transgender is to have a gender identity which doesn't match your sex assigned at birth. So if there is no such thing, or you can't make any sense of the notion of gender identity, then of course there aren't any trans people. But that is surely just a mistaken theory about what it is to be transgender. So you can certainly have all the skepticism you like about gender identity and still think, yeah, of course there are transgender people. Caitlyn Jenner is one such.
Well, I know a lot of feminists would say they're men LARPing as women. And I don't have a problem with that. I really don't. I find that the policing of language in this and other arenas has gone so off the charts that I almost want people to disagree with me now. I welcome the 90s and the 80s of when we could disagree and have a discussion and still be friends. This issue has divided people. People have lost family members. They have lost friends over these friendships. They have lost all sorts of personal and professional relations, not to mention housing, jobs, voluntary positions. We've had loads of them on the show. I've interviewed them for articles as well. And I think that we're in a crisis. Again, looking at this philosophically, if you think about what has happened over the last 300-400 years of human society and the way we think about life, this is a very definitive moment of navel gazing and the need for approbation from without. And in a way, it's its own religion, Alex. I always catch myself thinking, oh, it's an ideology, but then I wonder, is it an ideology or is this just a religion in the absence of religion?
Yeah, it's certainly right. People often say that it certainly does have its religious elements. And yeah, there are a number of striking parallels. It's not, I think the most sensible approach to these issues is, and maybe it's just because I'm an old-fashioned kind of guy, is just to take the old-fashioned view that, maybe medicalization is right for some people, but it's treatment for a medical transition. It's a treatment for a medical condition, in particular, a psychiatric condition. If that really resolves your mental anguish, then great. But let's not think of it as anything other than a somewhat unusual treatment for an extreme, because that's certainly the case for some people, extreme mental distress. It's not. You shouldn't frame it as the activists do, as something entirely parallel to the gay rights movement. So that, of course, is where the terms cisgender and transgender are supposed to do their work, because it's supposed to be reminiscent of homosexual and heterosexual. Just as, if you're heterosexual, then the target of attraction, the sex of the target of attraction matches your own sex. If you're heterosexual, then the target of sexual attraction doesn't match your own sex. And then there's something parallel with gender identity substituted for the target of sexual attraction in the case of transgender and cisgender. And just as to be gay or straight, well, that's just natural human non-pathological variation. So transgender, cisgender, that's again a matter of non-pathological natural human variation. So there is this very strong strand in modern trans activism, which insists that to be transgender is not at all pathological, in the same way that to be gay is not at all a pathological condition. But then, of course, you do run up into this sort of contradiction that, for some people, for some unknown reason, drastic medical interventions are required to put them on a psychological even keel. Not every transgender person needs medical intervention or puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones or surgery, but some do. It's never quite explained just why some of these transgender people need these medical interventions, but some do. But there, of course, the parallel with being gay completely breaks down, because being gay is not a medical condition and doesn't need any treatment.
Well, the parallel is right there, and that it's a regression to the mid-1950s when gay people were pathologized.
Of course that's true.
It's ironic because then you have the same kind of Sturm und Drang within the trans movement of people, and it's ironic how this functions, because it also depends on if they have private health insurance in America or if they're in socialized medical territory, such as the UK. There's a huge bifurcation as to who really wants this to be pathologized so insurance will pay, and those who do not, because in most social medicine countries, often do not need the pathological writ of a doctor.
Yeah, that's right.
It's fascinating, that as well. I'm wondering about the dogpiling and academic controversies you've been put through because of your work on this. You've spoken out about the hostile environment in philosophy. How would you define the point at which academic disagreement crosses the line into professional harassment?
Yeah, I should say first of all that the kind of pushback and harassment, if you like, that I've received has been absolutely nothing compared with the sort of treatment that was meted out to Kathleen Stock or Holly Lawford Smith is another example.
Yes.
The author at the University of Melbourne. Maybe the fact that I'm a man is not irrelevant to explaining my relatively lenient treatment. Who knows?
No, I think that's true, actually. I do think that there has been much more flaming at women because not only are we socialized to accept this madness, but people don't like women like Kathleen and Holly and others who say, no, I'm sorry, I have two eyes, I have a brain, I'm using it. They don't like it, which is ironic because, I mean, the irony bells are you have these men calling these women transphobic, trying to take their livelihoods away, even successfully so. And they're behaving just as the feminists have, albeit stereotypically defined men, aggressive, mongering, etc., which is just a footnote.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like professionally, I'm now I'm now persona non grata in certain areas of the profession, but then on the positive side, I've found new friends and allies that I certainly wouldn't have found before if I hadn't waded into these shark-infested waters. I mean, the main thing, and I've had, the odd open letter and protests against my work and so on. Actually, maybe one reason perhaps that I've been sort of let off the hook to some extent is that compared to Kathleen and Holly, is that, well, certainly in the case of Holly, she's a radical feminist and she has a political agenda as well as a sort of academic one. Mm-hmm. She will turn up at Let Women Speak rallies or something like that. Whereas I don't have that activist streak whatsoever. I'm just more interested in the solely academic issues than trying to make the world a better place. I'm ashamed to say.
I had cracked up when I read a criticism of you basically arguing that your participation in the HHS report was an attempt to impose political views on medical policy. In fact, they said that your work on pediatric gender dysphoria constitutes a, quote, professional ethical lapse, unquote, because it's outside your specific area of expertise. Now, I had a laugh because, as you well know, 90% of the people driving this policy in medicine are also outside of the medical field. I mean, the advocates, I mean, the GLADs, I mean, all the formerly LGBT organizations that have tacked on numerous letters. I don't know what any of them means. I don't even care because in a way, as someone from within that quote unquote or sick community, I think it's time that we begin to conceive of not talking about our sexuality all the time. It's a bit boring. This weekend, Bologna has its gay pride, and I've been looking for subjects for an article I want to write about. I don't know if you're familiar with Ducky. It no longer exists, but Ducky was this sort of gay shame event in London every gay pride. It was like an anti-pride event by people from within the community. And I sort of liked it. I miss it. And I know that loads of my friends in New York, even when I moved to New York, I was 20, and they were all like, oh, gay pride's so boring. Come with us to Long Island or here or there because it's horrible. And even then, I had to sort of learn through this basic experience of life as to how commodified gay pride was by radio stations, Broadway shows. Yeah, out in Fifth Avenue dancing to We Are Family or whatever. It's great. It's fun. But that gets old really fast because it's sort of this kind of adolescent, early 20-year-old experience that gets very old very fast. At the same time, I understand why historically it existed, but I have to wonder if this kind of awareness around the gender dysphoria phase of publicity, and then the transgender and don't be hateful and trans women are women, live with it. And they even made an Oyster card pass about this at one point. I'm just like, why are we being preached to? What has been a shift within late 20th century or even late stage capitalism where now everything's a mantra? And if you're not on board, you are somehow a neoconservative. And I say this because you said you've made friends with people you might not have before. And I can tell you from my experience, I imagine it might be in yours as well, a lot of the people fighting the battle against this madness are on the right. They're not neocons, but they're conservative. But they're conservative people who understand that gay men and women are not transgender, if you understand what I'm saying, because there's been that conflation as well. So isn't it wild where you've been accused of imposing yourself within a field that is not yours, but this is a field that has been largely created after John Money and his medical experimentation on children. I think that it's time to highlight that this has been largely foisted upon the public by middle class, the managerial elite. Even Adolf Reed talks about this in his piece on Good Caitlin, but bad what was her name, who pretended to be black and blah, blah, blah. I forgot her name.
Oh, Rachel Dolezal.
Dolezal, yeah. So one trans woman's good and one black woman's bad. A very interesting article he wrote. And then here you are battling what has been largely created from within the fields of the humanities. I'll just generalize and say the humanities.
Yeah. I mean, that criticism, I mean, in a way, it's not like totally unreasonable. It certainly would have been a good criticism if the HHS report on treatment for pediatric gender dysphoria was written entirely by philosophers or something like that. But of course, it wasn't. We had it's a multi-author team, and we had experts in psychiatry and endocrinology and methodology, medical ethics, and so on. And it's like the idea that sort of philosophers would have nothing useful to contribute. Well, that might be right, but it's sort of particularly amusing if the criticism comes from philosophers themselves, because philosophers themselves are typically obsessed with the idea that philosophy does have something to contribute to issues of public importance and debates on this and that, whether it's, climate change or COVID policies or whatever. In sort of normal times, I would have been praised for being one of the co-authors of the report, because here I am essentially showing everyone that, philosophy isn't this completely useless academic discipline. You can bring the tools of philosophy to bear on the great issues of the day. That criticism is particularly ironic, I think.
Well, it's fascinating because Foucault served for me in my work in child trafficking in Haiti as a template. And then more to the point, what we lived through in 2020 and 21 here in Italy, also where you are, where most people are, we lived through Agamben's state of exception. He was outspoken about this. I'm sure maybe you followed the breakdown between him and Jean-Luc Nancy as well over this. The Great Divide over COVID policy fractured a very long time friendship between these two men. And I felt like, you've read the book, you haven't seen the movie because you're living the movie. But lockdown was that. So I completely agree. Philosophy is crucial to understanding even our political dynamics today.
Yeah.
What the feminists have been talking about since I got involved with this in the language, and I had Julia Long tell me, why are you saying she to refer to a man? Very politely so. Because I too had been inculcated into this by living in New York, friends in the East Village who identified as. At the same time, I knew some of the people that were being used as eye candy for the transgender movement, claiming that this celebrity figure always identified as trans. And I'm like, no, I met him. He was a drag queen. And so you begin to untease some of the myth that floats around Butler's writing and that totally misunderstands her writing and that has given birth to this late stage gender ideology movement, which has nothing to do with the early days of gender trouble and queer theory.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, just on the pronouns thing, it is interesting how the gender critical feminists, for the most part, started off by respecting people's preferred pronouns. I think Kathleen certainly did that at the start. Also, Helen Joyce, at least to some extent, and then over the years, they became more hardcore about it and stuck to the sex-based usage. Yeah, incidentally, I mean, just to go back to cancellations and the climate in philosophy and so on, I mean, the main problem has been the suppression of work that mainstream writers on sex and gender disapprove of. So one of my many little cancellations was when I was invited to contribute a chapter to something called the Oxford Handbook of Applied Philosophy of Language on pronouns. So I was asked to do this, and normally when you're invited to contribute to one of these handbook chapters, the idea that your contribution might be rejected is just not on the radar. But anyway, to cut a long story short, I wrote this long piece about pronouns, which I'm quite proud of, and it certainly doesn't argue that trans people should be misgendered or trans women should be called he or anything like that. I think it's a great introduction to the topic, just what the doctor ordered, in fact. But cutting a long story short, my chapter was rejected with no possibility of revision. Some feminist philosopher, a woman who was also contributing to the Oxford Handbook, said that she would withdraw her contribution if mine was published. And in the end, the piece on pronouns was published by the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which, if that journal hadn't started, I think it was in 2021, I would have a lot fewer publications than I do now. At least on the topic of sex and gender, because lots of them ended up in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. But it's like, if you just read that, it's open access. Anyone can read my long, probably boring piece on pronouns in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. I think any reasonable person reading that would think, what on earth is offensive or objectionable about this? I'm not even arguing for some, controversial view, for instance, that pronouns should always be used in line with people's sex or anything like that.
I've been on the receiving end of the same. I had published a chapter in a book, University of Toronto Press. The same editor came to me, wanted me to write about, just to be vague here for a moment, because I should perhaps name names at a certain point, because this is getting tiring, but I submitted a chapter about the gender wars, okay? And I was persona non grata within a day. We can't run this. I knew what it was about, and I confronted her, and I said, if this problem is about the gender issue, let me know now. I wasn't about to change it. I wanted to confirm. And silence. So then, more recently, I have a chapter in a book with many others. I believe Kathleen has a chapter in the book, and there's many of us contributing. That book was supposed to be out about 18 months ago, but we had our contract canceled. And it is coming out of from a new publisher, I believe, at the beginning of 27. So this has happened. And I have stories of other people that had books canceled, and they've asked me not to talk about it if I present them on the show or whatnot. But it's widespread. And I'm glad the report you mentioned at the beginning has been made, because I think we are living in a very dangerous time academically where students are very smart. It doesn't matter where they went to high school. They enter into this world of academia and they see policing of language. They're not going to go to university. We're already seeing the lowering of inscriptions of university students. And I think part of it is about this. Why would you take out a student loan, go into debt, to go to have an ideological makeover, as it were?
Yeah.
It's basically you're being queered all over and you have no say in your own subjectivity. How do you feel about being described as a counter-revolutionary figure in the gender wars?
That sounds like Andrea James.
Yeah.
Who runs that website, Transgender Map. I think she describes me. She recently updated my page, apparently. She described me as like some sort of historical figure in the anti-trans movement or something. Yeah, it's certainly certainly strange times. I should say, it's of course the actions of the Trump administration are not helping, and there's a lot of crackdowns on universities and assaults on academic freedom, and there was a recent incident or policy at the Texas Tech University system.
That's right.
Where, according to I think it was the chancellor of the whole university system, courses have to be screened. So screened for problematic content, like any suggestion that there might not be two sexes, well, that's definitely disallowed. But also it was even broader. I think you're not really allowed to talk about sexual orientation in courses, which seems a little odd to take that topic off the table entirely. But yeah, so that was very bad. And of course it absolutely doesn't help if you want to push back against the censoriousness of the other side.
Yes, and I think a lot of us were warning back 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I was saying, this is going to come back on us. There are already people who say things like gay, trans, whatever that means, because they don't know the difference. And why? It's sort of like, if I might use a comparison here, the way that Zionism has been glued to Judaism. People do not understand the difference if they haven't scratched the surface or if they don't have the time to do the reading.
Yeah.
So they're being told gay, trans, it's whatever, and it's your identity, your lived reality, your inner truth. And I'm like, oh God. Because again, my revulsion around this time of year in gay pride, I'm just like, if my sexuality is the most interesting thing about me, then we're all in trouble. It's a bit like a phase of, it's a Freudian Fort Da phase. Let's get over it. Let's just stop talking about it. We have rights. We should be focused on maybe not starting genocides, maybe not selling arms to genocidal nations, maybe not, like we have all these other things we could be, our allotment. Let's get some cabbage growing. What are we doing here? I'm sorry, Alex, I get so frustrated on this subject because it seems to have been, you mentioned Trump. People get very upset about him. But one thing he did early in his administration was put the kibosh on this. And I knew that was going to cause ire and people would call him a censor. And I'm thinking, irony much? You were behind Tuvel being not given tenure, for instance. People were writing letters.
Yeah.
Or that Veronica Ivy, who's had many name transformations, the Canadian cyclist who went around insisting that he was a woman. And it was like insane times there too.
Yeah, well, Veronica, I mean, Rebecca did actually get tenure at the end of the day.
Oh, that's true.
She did survive her cancellation. But yeah, Veronica Ivy, Rachel McKinnon, she was at the College of Charleston, I think.
That's right.
McKinnon was an academic philosopher and then left philosophy under somewhat mysterious circumstances. But McKinnon or Ivy certainly was a character back in the day. And what was interesting was that lots of some of the things, I'll just use the preferred pronoun. Some of the things she said were just like so like incredibly obnoxious. Like this was back in the Twitter days when the gender criticals were kicked off Twitter, but people like McKinnon could say whatever they wanted. At one point, she said like TERF should die in a grease fire or something.
That's right. Yeah, die in a fire was a big.
And the funny thing is that established feminist philosophers thought that the sun shone out of Rachel's arse, basically.
It's true.
She was great. Like there's nothing to object to in this whatsoever.
Well, looking back on the past few years, what is the single most important lesson you have learned about the intersection of public policy, philosophy, and social media outrage?
Oh gosh, that is a difficult question. I don't know if there's a single most important lesson. Well, I think again, this doesn't really answer your question that much, but perhaps I can make some adjacent point. I mean, the thing that I have learned is that these firestorms of protest, just like firestorms in general, tend to blow over remarkably rapidly. They don't always blow over, but they usually do. So if everyone in positions of authority just faces them down, or even better, ignores them, then they just tend to pass by in a week or so. Like the worst thing you can do is to make concessions or issue apologies, let alone cancel books or cancel invitations to speak or anything like that. If you just stick to your guns, then the protesters will just move on to an easier target. And so much of the controversies in the past decade or so could have been avoided if people in positions of authority had more backbone. In particular, publishers who just turned out to be just as spineless, if not more so, than academic philosophers.
And have you had colleagues within your own institution support you? And how was MIT through all of which you?
Oh yeah, no, MIT's been great. I mean, there's certainly some tension in the department at a relatively mild level, because not all the faculty members are on exactly the same page as me with respect to these issues. But MIT, the institution, has been very supportive. They were particularly good when the HHS review came out, the one on pediatric gender dysphoria. And, I got some hate mail and some threats and whatever. And I had the numbers of two people at the Justice Department on my phone for a while, in case anything bad happened. But MIT was very good at brushing aside criticisms or demands to have me fired.
Excellent. That's a wonderful news, because that's not always the case, as you know. We've been there historically, watching how medical intervention tried to solve a socio or psychiatric or socio-psychiatric issue. And I'm thinking back to the mid-20th century when a good friend of mine was in the 50s given shock therapy because his parents thought he might be gay. This was par for the course. And we saw the use of shock therapy for women who didn't want to get married, who didn't want to be in a convent. I mean, all sorts of scenario perpetuate our history. These techniques have been decried and disavowed by medical professionals, by institutions, by even orders, medical bodies themselves. Why on earth has this happened again, Alex? Because it seems to be a rinse and repeat, as if, are humans not learning the lesson once?
Well, I think there's a relatively, we're talking about the resurgence, or sorry, not resurgence, the surge in medical treatment for gender dysphoria, that has a fairly straightforward explanation. And it goes back to the Dutch clinicians in the 1990s who saw that adult patients were not doing as well as they had hoped. And one of the hypothesized reasons was that they didn't pass particularly well. And they had the idea that, well, earlier transitioning, if you could catch them before puberty had done its work, earlier transitioning would mean that the person would pass better, particularly in the male to female case. And so the psychological results would be a lot better. People would be doing much better as transgender adults than they currently were. So that was the start of the so-called Dutch protocol, where puberty blockers are given at the early stages of puberty, followed by cross-sex hormones, and then surgery. And that was exported to the United States in particular around 2007, I think, when the first pediatric gender medicine clinic opened up at Boston Children's Hospital. So I don't think the origin of pediatric medical transition is that mysterious. And also, it's not, I don't think it's particularly sinister either. I think these clinicians in general, had the best interests of their patients at heart and thought they were doing the right thing.
I can see that many might have thought they're doing the right thing, but then isn't there a point, we've seen many medical professionals say, wait, we're sterilizing mostly gay youth. I think they did wake up to what they had been involved in. So I'm wondering what would keep some from recognizing that this might be a contagion, not just a social contagion. I would even argue a medical contagion, Yeah?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, maybe there's a general answer to that, which is that doctors are often very reluctant to admit that they've made mistakes. And, there are many previous cases where it's taken taken them a long time to turn the ship around, and ineffective or harmful treatments are being given, even when the evidence for their efficacy just isn't there. And some people are raising doubts and so forth, but people are stuck in their ways, and they get committed to a certain way of doing things. And of course, there is the general human reluctance to admit that you've made some mistake, especially when the mistake might be a really terrible mistake, like, well, whoops, you've sort of inadvertently sterilized a whole bunch of kids who would have just grown up to be normal gay adults.
But do you see there being a shift in terms of any of these professionals or institutions making even a broader confession of mistake and culpability than we saw from the Tavistock?
No, not really. I mean, of course, things have changed a lot, both in the UK and the US. And in the UK, obviously, the precipitating event was the 2024 CAS report. Without that, we certainly wouldn't be where we are today. And you can think of the HHS report as sort of a sequel to CAS, or adding various things, in particular a long chapter on the ethical issues raised by pediatric medical transition that CAS didn't explicitly address.
I think what you pointed out in terms of what the Dutch were trying to do in getting to children earlier to make them live happier lives had originally a good intent, but it also had a lack of foresight, because obviously you're touching the bodies of children who, my God, my daughter wants to be a dancer and a singer today, but next week it'll be a surveyor and architect. You understand? Like, this is insane to me, to be giving the power to, it's an Americanism, but the client is always right? The customer is a king.
Yeah.
And in a way, capitalism has entered medicine in a very negative sense.
Yeah. It's also in this I really can't explain, but of course, if you grew up, in the 70s or 80s, you can't help but notice that, back in the day, there really didn't seem to be these transgender children who would kill themselves if they weren't medically transitioned or given puberty blockers. Obviously, there were transsexual adults back in the day, but no one ever thought, or no one ever noticed, that there were all these suffering children whose suffering could be alleviated if they were given puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So then why are things so supposedly so different today? It's almost as if many people have this selective amnesia, or just can't remember what things were like back in the day. Sometimes it's obvious that before the medical treatment came along, there was a huge amount of suffering. Before the measles vaccine came along, lots of kids died from measles. That was sort of obvious. Or before the polio vaccine came along, lots of kids really suffered from polio. That was just obvious. But what is entirely unobvious is that there was any significant suffering due to gender distress among young people in the 70s and 80s. But of course, now it's presented as, well, look, some kids really are transgender. And, well, as the then Assistant Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine, put it, this is in the Biden administration days, gender affirming care is suicide prevention care. But then you might think, well, where were all these suicides back in the day before gender affirming care? Of course, they didn't exist.
I remember when Levine said this, and this fits into like Stephanie Davies-Arai, who's working on that on the ground. And the threat implicit to parents is if you don't go along with a child's idea or fantasy or whatever you want to call it, you are then killing your children, which is exactly what the head of Mermaids told the British public, which is exactly what the transgender doctor who's been shown the door in the UK to issuing scripts, now she operates out of Spain, is saying.
What's her name?
Yes, I've repressed her name. I can see her face because now she does all this PR through TikTok.
Helen Weberly.
That's
Helen
it.
Weberly. Yeah.
Helen Weberly.
Yeah, then I don't know if you heard the New York Times podcast from a few years ago called The Dutch Protocol. Sorry, it wasn't called The Dutch Protocol. It was called The Protocol. It was like a 5-part podcast, something like that. It was extremely good, and they managed to track down patient zero, the very first person, a girl who's given puberty blockers by the Dutch. Anyway, in that podcast, there are a number of clips from the gender doctor who used to be at UCLA Children's Hospital, Joanna Olson Kennedy, saying that if you don't transition your kid, then suicide is a distinct possibility. It's much better to have a live daughter than a dead son, and so on.
Exactly. Again, this is part of what I noticed in studying and speaking with people who've been through this, is they are groomed online. Loads of women have written about this as well, but they are groomed online. They are told what to say precisely to their GP to get the referral, to get the drugs, to get the process escalated. Duh. Of course. I remember when I was looking for a flat in the middle of Islington, people not knowing the rules on immigrants, they said, well, why don't you get a council flat? Just say you're a lesbian, you'll get one. They knew what to say. And I'm like, I can't get a council flat. I don't need a council flat. Yeah. But this is like, people know what to say. And the fact that this was sort of elided from the entire debate, or the fact that the suicide threat was also not mentioned in the whole brouhaha with Stonewall, It becomes a point of when can we have honest debates in civil society, even disagree, and we don't have to be enemies or frenemies, but who knows how it will end. But why can't we debate this? And that was something that was not allowed even in the UK until a few MPs, and I mean on the right of the aisle, came forth and they helped women speak out about this. And I think it's in great thanks even to the House of Lords, by the way.
Yeah.
It made me reevaluate the importance of the House of Lords. This whole thing did a whole shift in my brain because I'm like, oh, this is brilliant. Now I see, because they're too rich to care. They are untouchable. Like there's an advantage to being of that class and speaking common sense, I began to see.
Yeah.
And things shifted. On the same token, we shift to the US and people are talking about Trump, right? They call Trump that, and they're angry that he did. I'm thrilled of what he did. He knocked the nail into the wood. Of course, they're not going to be happy. Of course, they're going to say, and I'm not surprised by what you're telling me about the policing now within educational institutions, and now we can't say the word gay. It's the other side of the coin. I'd like to maybe end on a question about what is happening within the classroom, because a lot of people I know have had great concern for the fact of not only policing outside of academia, but within the classroom. How can university classrooms remain spaces for civil discourse when students arrive with the precondition that certain ideas are inherently harmful or murderous or violent?
Yeah, so right, that's a very relevant question in the present time. I mean, at MIT, along with a couple of colleagues, one of whom is in philosophy. In response to these sorts of concerns, we started something called the Civil Discourse Project, Civil Discourse in the Classroom and Beyond, which involved, well, a number of initiatives, but the main one was a speaker series where we would invite mildly controversial speakers to campus and, pair them with someone who had an opposing view. And then we would just throw the event open to the MIT community and encourage as many undergraduates to come as possible. And that has actually been pretty successful, I think. We had a large grant from some foundation to start it off. We're looking for more money to help it continue. But even the most hot button events have been manageable and have passed off without a hitch. So we had one fairly recently on gender affirming care. The title was "Should Minors Have Access to Gender Affirming Care?" And the speakers were James Cantor, you may know, who's James is great. And then Amy Tishelman, who was actually at Boston Children's, and then definitely left under a cloud and sued Boston Children's, I think, for discrimination or something, and won a significant amount of money. And anyway, Amy is now at Boston College. So James and Amy debated the issue: should minors have access to gender affirming care? James thinks no, Amy thinks yes. And there were rumblings of discontent before we had the event. This was, I think, back in February. There were threats of protest. Some of our posters advertising the event were torn down. A parallel rival event was organized at the same time, but it all went off without a hitch. I mean, I think it was clear that lots of the people who turned up to the parallel event ended up coming to our event. So it's not as if the people who thought that the event should never have taken place just didn't turn up. In fact, they did turn up, and some of them asked questions, which was great. So I think what I've learned from doing the Civil Discourse Project is that if you set expectations appropriately, then it's relatively easy for the students to debate the most controversial topics without anyone melting down or having a hissy fit. If you can just demonstrate to them that, I mean, that's the whole idea of having our two speakers battling it out. If you can just demonstrate to them that it's possible to talk in some civilized way about these issues, even though the two speakers are on radically different poles, then that just sets an example, and the students are then sort of acclimated to stepping on the third rail from time to time. I should say that we tried to get someone to, when we were fishing around for people to oppose James, we tried to get someone from Boston Children's, which we did briefly before she later bailed. We tried to get some other really pro-gender affirming care doctor, I think from Boston University. He did not accept our invitation and wrote this strongly worded email back saying that the event shouldn't take place, copying the president of MIT in a futile attempt to get us into trouble. So, and none of this was surprising at all if you followed the debates about gender affirming care. It's very, very hard to get the hardcore gender affirming proponents to stand up and defend their position against opposition. Someone like James Campbell, who really knows the literature.
Again, back to lockdown. It's like, what happened there? Will there be a truth and reconciliation about the denial of basic human rights to move? We had a problem in Italy. It's still a problem. Dogs are being abandoned because people got dogs just to get out of the house legally. Insane, but true.
Yeah, right.
It comes down to the same thing in both cases. Who will admit that they allowed their child to take a vaccine that might have caused their death, in the case of people who have made links between myocarditis and the vaccine, or in this case, even worse, who have allowed their children to be sterilized, have double mastectomies, have various other procedures to sterilize them, even though now the numbers are in. It would very much seem that most of the men who identify as are not doing surgical or hormonal treatments. The females are, which again buttresses a lot of the feminists' arguments in this completely. Will there be a time that we can have truth and reconciliation about this? And because there are victims. They're primarily, of course, those who have had their bodies destroyed, and who will have even future cases of cancer related to these synthetic hormones. Well documented, by the way. Nobody has touched that. No, let's just cheerlead these people into oncology wards. Horribly cruel, in my opinion. But the other victims are going to be people who have lost their careers. And there are many, even before Kathleen Stock, even before some of the no platforming that happened to high profile or even junior scholars like Tuvel, who's now no longer junior, however, or Holly. You had a lot of people who were a volunteer at a Girl Guides, losing her reputation.
Yeah, right.
Will there be a reconciliation of this, do you foresee, within even the UK? I don't think it would happen in the States because of the way Trump went about it. I think he made the right call, but I think it would have been more delicate to have a truth and reconciliation. Really, I'm very much about nunca más here. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not very optimistic about truth and reconciliation. It's because people find it so hard to admit that they made big mistakes, let alone that they've actually harmed some people in the process. I mean, I think the most we can hope for is that with regard to academia, the climate changes to become more hospitable to hosting people with heterodox views, and the cancellations of the past 10 years or so just become history. I mean, a lot of improvements have been made along those lines. I mean, so MIT, following the cancellation of the geophysicist Dorian Abbott, whenever that was, 2021 or something, have reformed their policies to some extent and are now much friendlier towards academic freedom and free expression. So that's one positive change that's already started, and with a bit of luck, there can be more change in that direction. And then as far as medicalization goes, I think the best you can hope for is that the medical associations themselves will turn around and not like explicitly admit we've made some terrible mistake, but at least change their policies. So, the American Academy of Pediatrics, for instance, which is still extremely gung-ho for pediatric medical transition could become considerably more cautious. I think that's a reasonable hope, because the evidence that's piled up over the intervening years against the efficacy of gender-affirming care for minors is now getting overwhelming, I think.